I wanted to explain why I'm doing this oral history before I get into my story today. When my grandfather and grandmother, my Uncle Bob, who served in Korea, my mother, were all alive, I never made it a point to record any of their stories, any of their experiences, and there were many. My grandmother was a ragtime pianist, and my grandfather helped to introduce Crisco and Duncan Hines cake mixes during the war to hotels and restaurants all up and down the East Coast. My Uncle Bob served in Korea as a translator and cryptographer, and my mother was one of the first real working women in the 60s. And she, a year before she passed, was going to be named a alumni emeritus by the George Washington University School of Business. Oddly enough, 1 year to the day before she passed. I never had a chance to get these stories down, and I regret that. And I regret it for two reasons why I'm doing this today, which happens to be 9/11/2021. Today is the 20th anniversary of the horrendous attack on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, back on September 11th, 2001, by radical Islamic terrorists. And secondly, the reason I'm starting with this, one, it's an impactful day in our history. Secondly, I've always had a fascination about people who did things in their lives that warranted an expanded obituary, meaning a story, not just the listing of their passing. Like a school teacher who taught at the same school for 30 years, or a simple government employee who did tremendous civic and community work, someone who had a tremendous hobby or was known for some little bit of fame, little something extra in their life. And as you're watching this, whether you're watching it on September 11th, 2021, or you're seeing this years later on YouTube or Facebook or whatever media it has been shared to, maybe even long after I'm gone, I wanted you to get a sense of what happened on September 11th, 2001. I am not a hero, and I'm speaking to you not as the actor or radio person or announcer. This is just me. I'm not wearing any makeup or anything fancy. I've got one single light up here just to make things visible in the scene. This is just me. And it's not through any sense of self-importance. It's just to give you a story of something that happened. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, that Tuesday, I was off. I was the program director for a national talk radio network based here in D.C. And about 9 o'clock, I called in, even on my day off, to make sure that the guests that I had lined up for that evening and afternoon were still set to go, and there were no issues where I would have to come in and take care of some things. I wanted to make sure I had a clear day off. And I noticed, a little after 9 o'clock, a story kind of chirping on the TV. I didn't pay too much attention to it, but by the time I got through speaking to the producers, that were handling the lineups that day. The second plane hit the other tower in New York. And I said to the producer on the line, I have a feeling this is going to be a bigger news day than what we originally thought. I'm going to shower, get dressed, and come in. When I got out of the shower and was getting dressed about 15 minutes later, my apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, to the western and northern part of the city, right on the border with Arlington, I had a 12th floor apartment and I could see into the city. At about 9:35, I was getting things together and finally getting dressed and looked out, and I saw the plane hit the Pentagon, the southwest corner of that building, which is, if I am correct, the Navy side of that building. I immediately got back on the phone. My cell phone, in those days, better reception outside, especially in a high-rise. I was on the 12th floor. I called into the studio line so that I could be put on the air, and I said, I don't know whether this has hit the news yet, but I just saw a plane hit the Pentagon. And I got on and I gave an eyewitness account, about 10-12 minutes long, and did my thing with the host that was on, and hung up, called the producer back, and I said, if I can make it in, I'm coming right in. I hadn't planned to be in until about 10 or 11 anyway, and this was bigger than I thought. I grabbed a few things, ran downstairs, got in my car, and if you know anything about the D.C. area, Route 395 that cuts through Northern Virginia, when it gets to a certain point in Arlington, it splits. You either go around the southwest side of the Pentagon, towards the Memorial Bridge and the Lincoln Memorial, or you go straight and across the 14th Street Bridge. Well, when I got to that point, you couldn't go towards the Memorial Bridge. You could only go across the Potomac River on the 14th Street Bridge. As I got to the entrance point of the city, where the Bureau of Engraving and Printing is for the Treasury Department, and now the building after that is the Holocaust Museum, you could see every other block there were military vehicles. We're talking urban assault vehicles, tanks, armored vehicles of various kind, and military personnel fully armed at every other block. Couldn't go up 15th Street because that ran right next to the Treasury Department and the White House. I went up 14th to our radio network, which was at that time in the building just south of the Washington Post building. I want to say 14th and L. Went to our third floor studios because at that point we had not moved upstairs to the upper floors. Those studios were being built. And the show hosts were really doing seat of the pants radio. Now luckily I had brought with me a couple of things. Business cards to make sure that I could get through some of these military checkpoints, showing that I was a working journalist, and I also brought about a 25-30 page printout that had phone numbers of people that I knew, just as a backup, instinctually grabbing that. I know that sounds antiquated, but this was before online Rolodexes and keeping all these contacts in your phone and so forth. Well, I thought about it, and I said, look, you're trying to get through to people on their cell phones, and these towers are either down or they're jammed. Let me look through and see what I can find in terms of home phone numbers, direct landlines that we might be able to get through on. As it turned out, on my list was a CNN reporter by the name of Peter Arnett. Peter at that time was one of only 2 Western journalists to have spoken to this fella Osama bin Laden, who we would come to find out was very important in the scheme of things. I knew Peter because way back in 1995, we were on the same flight from Los Angeles to Taipei, Taiwan. I was going over to become the program director of the English language radio station for Taiwan. Peter was going over to cover the first democratically held presidential elections in Taiwan, which had caused mainland China to put warships in the Taiwan Straits, remembering that Taiwan is an island off the coast of China that China claims it has control over. On that list was Arnett's home phone number, the landline. I tried it. He answered. I introduced myself again. He said, "Oh, yes, sure." And I asked him if he would come on. And it was only for about 10 minutes to tell us what he knew of radical Islamic terrorists and people in that region, and perhaps give us some insight into this fellow Osama bin Laden. And he was only supposed to be on for about 10 minutes. He was on for a good 30 minutes, and then in addition to that, and this was after 12 noon, he came on 2 more times that day and did a tremendous job. Now, the second thing I had to handle was, who are we going to get to replace our afternoon hosts? Because our afternoon host was Colonel Oliver North. He had been spirited away to be with Vice President Cheney at whatever point they were sequestering Cheney for safety reasons. I don't know whether it was Camp David or some other place, but Colonel North was not ours for the rest of the week. In my phone list, I happen to have the number of a young congressman in his first term as representative from Indiana's 1st District, who had been a talk show host, among other things, on the radio before he was elected to Congress. A fellow you might know by the name of Mike Pence. Congressman Pence came on that afternoon, filled in for Oliver North, did a terrific job. And second call I made was to a fellow by the name of Doug Tracht. Now, radio listeners in D.C. and L.A. would know Doug Tracht better as the Grease Man, the character that he portrayed on the radio, completely off the wall, crazy, flamboyant, obnoxious character, completely opposite of what Doug really is. I met Doug at the Heritage Foundation months before that and realized this guy is a real patriot. If I remember correctly, Doug was a police officer at one time. And I said, "Doug, for the next 2 or 3 days, it would be great if you could fill in for Colonel North without any of the Grease Man veneer. Just be yourself. We're only going to introduce you as Doug Tracht. We're not going to mention Grease Man at all. And I will produce your show. I'll set up guests, handle the callers. I'll get you through this." And he said, "Okay." The next 3 days, he did a terrific job. Now, after we get through Tuesday through Friday, Saturday morning, actually Friday night to Saturday morning, my mother and I had already long planned a trip to Cooperstown in upstate New York to go to the Baseball Hall of Fame. Hotels were paid for and reservations were made and so forth. We left on, I would say, late Friday night, maybe 11 or midnight, after me putting in 4 12-hour days in a row. I needed to get away, to reset. As we left her home in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and of crossed over to Route 95, and then headed up to Baltimore. We got to the Harbor Tunnel, and then just beyond that, where you have 95 going straight up, we realized there was hardly any traffic on the road. Maybe one or two 18-wheelers where normally, because that's the main route from Miami to Maine, 95 is the major trucking route, one or two 18-wheelers at best. Mostly state police cars and a few military vehicles at strategic points, like when the Baltimore Beltway met 95. So all the way through Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, it was like this. It was just empty. It was barren, as if life had stopped. So we get to the western side of the city of New York. We looked over at Manhattan, and this was about, I'd say, 4:30 or 5 in the morning. The island of Manhattan was pretty much dark, but at the southern tip, the work lights shone up into the sky with a haze of dust and debris and whatever else is created by them working still to go through the rubble to find survivors. A stark bit of imagery, if there ever was one. We continued up and arrived in West Point, where the military academy is, about 6:30. About 3-4 blocks to the west of the main gate of the military academy is a very typical small town diner. We went to the diner, had some breakfast. There wasn't much conversation going on then. The place only held about 20 people, but there was no intrusiveness about conversations. It's very quiet, very introspective. Now, as we left West Point to go up to Syracuse and then across to, God, I hope I'm getting that right, Schenectady, Syracuse, to go to the next main city. See, you can tell this is not rehearsed. Before we turned to go to Cooperstown, we went north from West Point and stopped at the Culinary Institute of America and small towns on the way up. And as the sun started to come up, fire departments and small-town police departments and Kiwanis and Rotarians and Lions clubs and all of these civic groups started to come out to the 1 or 2 stoplights in these small towns, offering little attachable American flags. It had a post and a little clip on them so you could put them on the window of your car. And you roll the window up and the flags would stay there and fly. We bought 2 sets. Well, after we spent the night in that big city, I'm really apologizing whether it's Schenectady or Syracuse, we headed west to Cooperstown, to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And even more flags were for sale, including a 6-foot by 4-foot American flag that is hanging in the main window about 25 feet away from where I am now, facing outward in that window as a reminder. It's essentially floor to ceiling. That flag used to hang in my mother's window when she lived in Gaithersburg before she passed. And I have promised to always fly that flag in remembrance. As we go to Cooperstown, we could hear church bells ringing in small towns. And we heard the same as we were coming home through Pennsylvania. And when we got home to Mom's place in Gaithersburg, I was going to spend the night and go to work Monday morning from there. There was a message on her answering machine. There was a female naval officer who lived just a couple of doors down from her, who had the most beautiful, I mean absolutely adorable, little 3-year-old girl. It seems that 3-year-old girl had died in the Navy nursery when the plane hit the Pentagon. Today, that little girl would be 23, 24, perhaps starting a family of her own. And she never got that chance. And sadly, less than a year later, her mother, the naval officer, who everyone just adored, they were just a wonderful family. Her mother, out of despair and depression, took her own life. So when those conspiracy theorists say stupid things like, well, the planes that hit the World Trade Center were planned so we could go to war, and there's no way at that angle that a plane could hit the Pentagon, bullshit. I saw it for myself. And yes, it can happen. And to those conspiracy theorists, I offer you a giant fuck you. You don't realize, in addition to the 3,000 who died, how many police officers and firefighters and first responders and doctors and nurses and volunteers and construction workers who went through debris, who were affected, who have either since died from inhaling the dust and all the stuff that was in that rubble, or just passed away for whatever reason related to 9/11. You don't realize the ripple effect of what happened 20 years ago today. And you're fooling yourself if you do. And I'm going to say one thing before I wrap this bit of oral history up. Today we are so divided, so polarized as a nation, that something like 9/11 could happen again because we are so divided. And I'm not asking you to accept the other person's point of view, but just understand it without hate, without cancel culture, without wokeness, without bullshit of pushing people out of your lives or creating hatred simply because they hold a different point of view than yours. Because I will guarantee you this, you must learn your history. If we continue as divided and polarized as we are today, something like 9/11 will happen. And it will be worse than what happened in 2001, I guarantee you. And I'm going to close this out just by simply saying, if and when it does happen, when you see this on 9/11/2021 or some years in the future, if that cataclysmic event, that attack happens again, God help us all. Smarten up.